We'll give people another minute here to trickle in before we kind of get things started. We appreciate everybody taking time out of their days to come and join us today on this great webinar that we're going to go through on proficiency and MasterClass, from first drive to final sign off.
Yeah, we truly understand how valuable your time is when you're running a school or multiple schools. So hopefully we will add some value to your day.
But yeah, thanks to everybody for joining today. We're going to be going through proficiency from first drive to final sign off. So how to track, document, and defend a student's proficiency. So we're going to be diving in here. So it's kind of like the main three questions that we're going to want to go through today is, why is proficiency documentation important? What should instructors be tracking? And how should training be documented? What's in the regulations and why is it required for completion? Not just completing it, but also just, actually documenting training. What should instructors be tracking? So the core skill areas, we're going to go through all of that today. And then how should training be documented? That goes with using consistent scoring, instructor notes, having corrective actions for students, and of course, final sign-offs. Before we dive into that, just want to give a little background. Tim, why don't you introduce yourself, and I'll go after you.
Sure, Jack. Again, welcome everyone. We're excited that you're here. My name is Tim McLain. I spent 34 years with transportation. Ran all the training centers for SWIFT. We had graduated by that time over 100,000 students. Been on the board of PTDI, CBTA. Been part of the CBTA task force meeting with FMCSA. Originally over this TPR and the number of providers on the TPR that should have never been on there. And what kind of led me to this path, when I left SWIFT last year, we were one of the earlier adopters of CDL Power Suites, and was given the opportunity to come over here and play in the sandbox with Jack and the rest of the team here, and been having a blast ever since. So that's my Reader's Digest version, and it's up to you now, Jack.
Okay, appreciate it. So my name is Jack Githens. I've been at CDL Power Suite for the last couple of years. Primarily, some of the hats that I wear here, I'm the point of contact between Power Suite and FMCSA. So I talk to auditors on a semi-frequent basis, and it's just increased as they've increased their audits out there. And so we've met with auditors, we've met with leadership of FMCSA, and have kind of been our main point of contact for them. So just talking to them day in, day out, understanding what they're looking for. It's a big part of my role. I've trained over 500 training providers on CDL Proficiency. So that's a lot of what we do here, is helping training providers out with just understanding what they're supposed to be training on, because we all know that you guys are doing great training out there, but it's really looking into regulations and understanding where we can have more documentation. And then the other piece is going to be conducting on-site training for CDL training providers. That's something else that we do a lot of as well.
Guys, we see the messages, and James is trying to figure it out. It's inconsistent. Some of you get an echo and others are not. So we see that. And as James said, we will send this out in a video afterwards if you're not able to hear. Some of the comments are saying it's so bad they can't understand what we're saying, Jack. So
okay. Yeah. We'll go through it. I apologize. We'll send all this out as well. All right. So the question we want to get started with is, behind every student file, how did you know the student was proficient? Where did the student start? What skills were they having difficulty with? What corrections did the instructor provide, or what corrections need to be made? Where did the student improve? Did they improve? Who evaluated the student? And then when did the student demonstrate proficiency? These are some of the things I want you to have in the back of your mind as we go through this. But these are some of the questions that kind of go into our main thing, which is telling the story of proficiency. And we'll drill into some more strategies and stuff like that here in a little bit.
And we're kind of in a unique position with over 500 entities that are now partners with us on this system. And we're also fortunate because of different organizations where we have a lot of contact with FMCSA. And one thing everybody needs to understand, these audits are going to continue to go forward. And a lot of this feedback you're going to hear from us is directly feedback from schools that have been audited or from the FMCSA. And these guys are going to continue to get better at their audits and get a little more consistent. They're a little bit all over the page now. But you want to be able to describe what proficiency is, and you want to be able to demonstrate that your instructors are not just pencil pushing stuff. So this is very important as we move forward.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Moving on to the next slide. One of the biggest things that we see is completion is not the same as proficiency. So checking a student off, did they finish your program, is just not the same as actually tracking proficiency. The completion answer is, did they finish the program? Where when we're looking at more of the proficiency, could the student consistently perform the required skills to a proficiency standard? Certificate's that final outcome piece, and but the proficiency record is evidence that supports that outcome. So that's just one of the pieces. We'll be getting into more of that as well. So Tim, I'd like you just to maybe touch on a little bit why, and a lot of you probably already heard this, but why FMCSA didn't set the minimum standards for behind the wheel, and what does that mean for providers? Oh, you're muted there.
I'm doing the same thing you did. It sounds like they're the echoes and calls of a different problem than you and I on our mics, it looks like. So a lot of us are familiar with this. We've been involved. This has been almost a process for almost 30 years now, the entry-level training standards. When they first came out, it was challenged in the court and it kicked back, and then the FMCSA made the rare but useful tool of the negotiated rulemaking. Took Teamsters, proprietary schools, state schools, and different parties involved in the industry, the school, bus industry, and did a negotiated rulemaking. And I know quite a few people that were on that committee, and it was quite intense. And when they came out, a lot of the stuff we're seeing was part of the negotiated rulemaking. And one thing that did not come out in the final rule is the 30 hours behind the wheel. And we point blank asked the FMCSA why they didn't do that. And the point that was kind of brought up is there was no science that equated the time equal to a safer driver. And so when the rule finally came out, it did not have the hours. Their intent is that we still track hours. They're wanting to know. And one of the things I think they made a big mistake is they didn't define what behind the wheel hour actually equated to, because some people are doing semester hours, some doing 50-minute clock hours, some are doing 60, some are just taking math and dividing it, this amount of students, this many hours. So I think they were going to try, their purpose was in this collecting the hours is they were trying to get some empirical data so they could eventually point out to that. But one of the things that X amount of hours equals a safer driver. But I think that CBTA and a few other organizations have done a real good job of trying to make them understand that that's bad data because everybody's reporting hours differently. So you're not getting good data out of that. So that's the history. That's where we are. I think their intent was to try to collect hours and get some empirical data and come up and say these hours equal to safer driver. Before that ever happens, though, they're going to have to define an hour and how it's tracked. And I don't see that coming in our lifetime. We'll be all retired and somewhere else by then. And Jack, I have like great-grandchildren.
Yeah. And so that's, it's kind of just want to set the stage. This isn't necessarily a webinar about hours or anything like that, but I think it's important to touch on that. That's still a piece we need to document, track, but how we got to where we're at now is with the proficiency standard. So what does the regulation actually require? And when I talk about the regulations, we're talking about the CFRs, and we'll share a link here in the chat. I think James has that link of the actual CFRs that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to stress it a couple times that we think it's important for everybody to read through these just one time. It's not super complex when it comes down to the language that's in there, but it's really helpful to understand and actually read through that start to back. So what's actually required, to cover the behind the wheel curriculum course, to evaluate the student's performance, determine and document whether proficiency was demonstrated, record total behind the wheel hours for both road and range, use appropriately qualified behind the wheel instructors, and conduct behind the wheel training with students in the actual control of the vehicle. A question we get every once in a while is, simulation learning on simulators. That's defined more in the classroom setting than it is on the actual behind the wheel portion.
Yeah, and you're probably going to, Jack, especially, you hear a lot of referring to the Class A, but a lot of this, as far as how rubrics go and evaluations and stuff, it doesn't matter what class. Actually, you could probably almost translate it to numerous things other than training in the CDL industry. So,
yeah, absolutely. And when we look at the gap of documentation, so this is what we typically see existing in a program. And we see this across the board. What does exist for most people? We have attendance records, completion of lessons. So maybe that's the theory portion, total training hours. And then most people that are, attempting to document their training, they will have like some sort of check mark system or something like that to check stuff off, and then a final certificate. What may be missing is that skill level evaluation, evidence that the student's progressing, instructors' corrections, remediation records, and dates of proficiency for a student. That last one right there, dates of proficiency and understanding a journey for a student, is a really big piece. The risk is you may be training everything perfectly fine, but if you're unable to, reconstruct that later and tell that story, it could be a problem. We were just kind of talking about this, the check marks. A pass or fail does not show progression, and it does not show proficiency. A check mark captures the moment, but it does not show the difference between intervention, improving, performing something independently, and being proficient, and then of course exceeding expectations. So we have a rubric that we're going to go through here in a little bit and kind of break this down for you.
As they've been going for all these audits, Jack, I'm sorry, but
no, you good?
And one thing that's already came up to there when you're talking to the FMCSA and conversations that are coming out about some of the audits or surveys they've done, is that pencil pushing's already they're becoming familiar with pencil pushing, and then the consistently how all the students are consistently the same. So kind of be aware whether you use paper, electronic, or whatever. They know everybody's not going to advance and develop at the same period in time. That's Atri did that study about 25 years ago when they were trying to determine how much time is needed to train a driver. And basically their conclusion was that when it's enough time, that everybody was different. Jack may need more hours than me. I may need more hours than James. And so it's everybody learns at a different pace. And so you want to tell that compelling story. Is there a reg that says that everybody can't? No. But what's going to happen if I'm an auditor and I came in and I see all these scores are all the same for everybody, or they just same every single class after class? That's going to incline me to dig deeper. And the goal you should have on all these audits should be like a driver going for a scale house, having his truck clean, neat, and organized, and not inviting anybody to dig any deeper than they need to. Because again, we all do a really good job, but we're all human and we make mistakes, and we don't want to give anybody an excuse to start digging through all of our records. We want to be as transparent and tell that compelling story of how the student went from being not proficient until they are proficient, and be able to tell all the in-between stops in that journey.
Yeah, great point there. We want to quickly open it up for questions. And as we see the chat kind of populate with some questions, a couple of things we want you to maybe consider is, how are you currently determining proficiency in your program? Because that's the next piece we're going to go into. Are all instructors using the same standards? Can you reconstruct a student's progression 6 months later? And what would you show someone if they asked how a student or why a student was certified? So think about those. We have a couple questions. Questions so far. So why is Class C not included in this, or are they? Class C is not included in the federal regs when it comes to this documenting the training for them. Where we see Class C be brought into this a lot is with like a hazmat or with like a passenger endorsement that's Class C. And then if you have that passenger endorsement, you are required to teach a lot of these same things. So if you're doing Class C with passenger, I recommend honestly just teaching what you would maybe teach in a Class A or Class B vehicle for that documentation purpose, because passenger is going to require that as well. This also is another question for this presentation, stuff like this. There will be a recording and stuff like that sent out after this is done. All right, I think we're going to continue on here, kind of getting more of the meat and potatoes of this. I know you all kind of came here looking for some of that, so we're going to kind of get into that right now. So we're going to use an example student of the Class A curriculum. Now, the Class A and Class B curriculum are going to be very similar. The difference with a Class A versus a Class B is, really going to come down to, let's see here. It's going to come down to the range where we have coupling and uncoupling, but a lot of the road and a lot of the theory is going to be very, very similar. So for a Class A student, we're going to briefly touch on the theory. The theory is the portion that the students have to go through. I'm sure most of you are doing theory with all of your students. The piece that I want to stress on for the theory is making sure that you have a quiz that goes with each of these sections. So one is like our units are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then there's sections within there. So 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. Having a quiz that goes with each one of these is going to be super important, because when that auditor comes in and says, hey, I want to see your curriculum, or hey, I want to see what questions your students got wrong, it's important to go back and say, well, these are the questions that I had for 1.0 and 1.2 and 1.3. So the theory portion is a little bit different. It's a little bit easier to document the proficiency because they're looking for an 80% on a quiz. But I would recommend having a quiz for each of these sections, because if you have a 20 question, 100 question quiz at the end and you don't go back and say which questions were related to each chapter, it's going to be really hard to demonstrate that proficiency when an auditor comes by. The next piece. Oh, go ahead, Tim. Yeah.
As we go into this, and again, because I'm usually having to do this by myself, so I'm a little bit distracted. I can actually read stuff coming across as we're doing it that I normally don't have time to do. But one thing to understand as we go through this is about the use of the rubric and how being consistent, and it's kind of like third-party testing. You want to be consistent. You want to be consistent and have validity in what you're doing, and you're going to see all the things that you see, the A3.1 and everything else that's listed in here. The FMCSA is telling you what you have to do, but it's not telling you how you define proficiency. You got to realize that's on you. And yeah, there's a lot of things in here. We could say there's a lot of holes you could drive an M1 tank through as far as what's required now compared to some of the things in the past. But again, it is up to you to define what the proficiency is on this. You can have standards higher than than what CDL testing is. Most people do. And one thing to keep in mind as we go through all this, they are going to start training, tracing back to the TPR where that student originated at. So keep in mind, it is in your best interest, in your entity's best interest, to make sure that these students get what they need to have and be safe out there on the road with our families and your family. So keep in mind, if you look in there at the definition of proficiency, you're not going to really see it, but you know what it is. So I just want to kind of touch in on that real quick.
Yeah, we'll help you define that today. That's our goal. That's one of our goals here. So for the road, this is what we're going to focus on today. So before we go into the road, I just want to touch on the pre-trip and the range. These are both things that also need to have documented proficiency. But for this exercise, for this example today, we're going to focus on the road category. Specifically, we're going to focus on A3.1 to A3.6. This is what we would recommend that you teach every single time you go out on a road drive with a student. You're documenting their progression through the training through these 6: vehicle controls, shifting transmission, communication signaling, visual search, speed and space management, safe driver behavior. This is across the board. Class A, Class B, B to A. You'll notice we have A3.8 to A3.12 as well on there. Those are more things that you need to demonstrate that you've had the conversation with the student and they understand how to operate in those situations, not that they actually have to demonstrate those in the real world. So those ones actually right there, those are where a check mark would be appropriate and saying, yep, we covered this, we covered this. But for the others, A3.1 to 3.6, it's going to be important to document that proficiency journey. So connecting these skills back to the regulations. We were just talking about this, so we're going to start kind of funneling down to the road module and talk about this and how we would set this up. So the proficiency areas, of course, are the regulations 3.1, 3.2, all the way to 3.6. The regs have a definition of that in there, but then it's also up to you to add a little bit in there for yourself. And it's up to you to define, like Tim was saying, it's up to you to define what proficiency is. So some examples of related curriculum topics with, vehicle controls, control systems, vehicle operations, basic controls, going all the way down through this as well. So I'm not going to touch on every single one of these right here, but these are just some examples of related curriculum and content that you could be teaching off of this from here. The important piece is to actually document this and actually say, hey, this is what we're going to teach. If you say you're teaching vehicle controls, well, what goes into vehicle controls? For us, it's, left turns, right turns, exits onto highways, those types of things. So why would we use a consistent rubric? Without a rubric, good can mean something different for every instructor, right? It becomes really tough to see a progression in a student's journey and actually sign off on a student's proficiency if we don't have a consistent rubric across the board. With a rubric, expectations become clear. Progress can be shown, weak areas become visible, and instructors' decisions are easier to explain. I see a lot of good questions coming in. We will get to all of these questions here at the end. So please hold on to those questions. Put them in the chat. We're going to go through all of them as well. All right, so let's break down the 5-point rubric for CDL Power Suite. So we just went through all the different things we need to cover. So let's take, A3.1 to A3.6. Each of these should be scored individually. So we at CDL Power Suite score this on a 1 to 5-star system. And the reason we do this is because we can show clear progression for a student's journey throughout their time. These are our 5 levels. 1 is unsafe. 2 is developing. 3 is progressing on track. 4 is proficient. 5 is exceeding expectations. Now, for that, we also have instructor roles and driver performance. So you'll see instructors' roles, for unsafe through exceeding expectations. Ultimately, what we're looking for on each one of these different regulations. So for A3.1, were they proficient or not, and what level would you put a student at? For A3.2, same thing. What does that look like? For us here, we have defined 4 as the proficiency threshold, with 5 is beyond this threshold. Now, why and how did we get to this? The regulations for theory define proficiency as 80%. And so we took that kind of same framework that's defined with the theory and brought that over to the behind the wheel curriculum. Proficiency has to be defined for both behind the wheel range, road, and theory. All 3 parts need to show proficiency and define proficiency for each one of those. So what does progression actually look like for a student? This is an example for like our visual search. On day 1, maybe they're receiving a 2 because they frequently miss side mirror checks. Maybe on day 3, they go out for another drive and they've improved their scan patterns. They needed reminders at intersections, stuff like that. Day 6, maybe they're recognizing those hazards but are reacting late to merging traffic. And then maybe on day 9, they actually start getting it and they're proficient at visual search. The final score, of course, matters, and documenting when they were proficient at something matters. But telling the story is also an important piece because there's no way a student's going to go out there on their first drive unless they've been driving trucks all their life and be proficient. I quickly want to just talk about notes here. Tim and I have spent a lot of time talking about notes and corrections from students, and this is an area that you can choose to do, but we're also going to give you a word of caution with that as well. So notes can be helpful, but the most important piece with notes is that if you leave a corrective note for a student, it's important that your instructors demonstrate or make an additional note after the fact that this student has corrected that behavior. This is especially important for in-house training providers. Tim, do you want to speak on this a little bit?
Yeah, you see a lot of in corporate America, less is more. And notes are one of those things. Instructors really love them. They love, if I'm an instructor, I love to be able to pull up and see the instructor that the student made on that student before, I took that student. But here's the thing about it, and this is speaking from experience, again, because I ran carrier schools and all of our records were discoverable, is that even if your host system is screaming that this student is proficient and doing all these other things, that one note on there, the student is deficient in one thing and not going back and noting that that student corrected that can be very expensive or cause you a lot of pain. So, I cannot stress enough, if instructor A is saying Jack's having trouble with lane position, somewhere in that history of that student, before you get them to the point of where you're turning them loose for a test, somebody needs to demonstrate or comment in there that that's been corrected. And that is so important. So if you're going to allow notes, you need to have the self-discipline, everything to go in there and make sure that if there's any negative in there, that it's been corrected. If it's a positive, no need to follow up on that. But if it's something negative, you need to have your team trained to go back and address that at some point, or be able to explain why the student was able to be marked proficient and graduate and that never addressed. So you need to be able to tell that story. And that's an expensive one. It can be.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to kind of go into a little bit more here, what every assessment should identify or what every training session should identify. So we're at CDL Power Suite, we like to break things down on a day-by-day basis. And the reason for that is because each day kind of presents new information for the students. It presents opportunities for growth, and documenting that is important. So for every assessment or every training session, what should we identify? The student, the date, and the instructor that you're working with. Training sessions and locations. So you may have like a road session in the morning and maybe a range session in the afternoon. Document those separately and assign time to them. Skills or curriculum items that are evaluated. So having that clearly defined. Scores and or proficiency. So there's a number of different ways people keep track of scores. We see it with the STAR system, or the 1 through 5 that we just went through. That's our recommendation for how to document it. We also see there are places where check marks make sense, pre-trips, or maybe that A 3.8 to 3.12. And then there is times where points maybe make sense, or maybe you want to look at it from like a percentage of 100 and assign point values to something and subtract from there. That's going to be more like a state test. And there is a difference between what the regulations are and what the state test is. We have, of course, instructor observations and notes when applicable. And then we do recommend that obviously you have a documentation of who worked with the student, right? The instructor acknowledgement of the training. And in a system like ours, the instructor is automatically assigned to the student. So it kind of flows and it makes sense, like who worked with the student, because it's logged in the system. But if you're documenting this on paper or Excel, have some way of saying that the instructor signed off on this, or the instructor acknowledges the training that they delivered. Okay, so we're gonna do kind of like a live demo here. I want to stress that however you're tracking your training, as long as you're kind of incorporating these points that we're talking about, that works. We see it done on paper. We see it done on Excel. We see it done in platforms and systems like ours. However you choose to document training, that is okay. We're going to show you how we do it. And hopefully, if you are using another platform, another system, or another way of doing it, you can take some of these notes back with you and your team and incorporate that into how you are conducting training. So just give me a second here. Tim, if you have additional things to add at this point, feel free to hop in while I get things set up here.
I will, again, because my peripheral vision is seeing the questions pop up, I'll just answer one. Somebody called me when I said it's going to cause you some pain, and where that came from experience as far as the comments. Remember now, your TPR is a roadmap all the way back to you when you turn a student loose out here in the world now. And so that's going to create some issues for you possibly. And again, I'm speaking from my experiences running a carrier school when anybody would get involved in something. And I would just give you a quick example. At one point in time, we had a student instructor on the first day or two put that the student was having trouble with lane positioning. You go through and watch all the evaluations and how they were evaluated every day, and it was clear that student had corrected that, but we never went back and addressed that. And then the state, you're supposed to have a primary and an alternate route when you take students on a road test. The state took the student on a primary route where they shouldn't have been doing it because it was in heavy construction and they had the lanes down narrow. And then we got involved in a situation where the student crossed over the line and hit somebody, and there was no fatality or anything involved in that. But when that got down to the point of where plaintiff attorneys got a hold of something, and they hung on that one thing that you should have never had the student test because you knew you had a problem with lane position. And even though all the other documentation pointed that the student did have that skill developed, just that one thing cost like $2 million. And where I'm going with this, I'm not expecting that's going to cost you $2 million. I hope not. But what I'm thinking is if you have a student that get involved in a certain type of accident, and then that puts your school up for an audit, or especially you guys who are doing private training, as Jack said, and they come in an audit and they see that you addressed that and you actually put a comment on there, but then you never went back and corrected that. That's what I mean, but it could cause you some pain. So comments are great, but they need to be taken seriously and followed up on.
Yeah, absolutely. James threw it out there. I think let's answer a couple questions here that are it's in the chat, and then we'll kind of go through how we document stuff here in a second. But I'm going to kind of run through some of these quickly. If more questions come up, feel free to throw them in the chat. Patrick asks, how do you reconcile this with state programs that have hour requirements specifically broken down by segments? That's a great question. So we're here in the state of Washington. We have a school that's attached to us up here. And so we have hour requirements. How we reconcile it is we make sure that, they have a road category and a range category, and they have like proficiency and combined as well. Those are things that are out there. We first highlight and track those road and range. And then once they're proficient on something, then we document the additional time in those segments. So take a look at that rubric that your state might be asking you to have and what categories they're looking for, and see how you can blend the federal regulations together with that. The feds don't have the hour requirement piece. So, look at the state requirements for the hour piece. And then of course, come back to the feds when you're looking at actually the documentation, because there's not really a state out there that's going to have rubrics or things that you need to, they'll oftentimes refer back to the feds when it comes to what you need to actually teach. They'll say, hey, refer to the CFRs for that piece. So use that for your rubric, and then the hour requirements defer to your state for that. We have another question about theory courses. If they're taken online, we don't actually conduct them in person. What can we do to show proficiency on that part? So proficiency is, of course, part of theory, and it's a part of behind the wheel training. So it's important to document the theory And how we would recommend doing that is having a quiz for each section of the course. So not just having one final test that they take, actually having a quiz for each section, which then all of those quiz scores end up being the entire theory score at the end of the program.
And it's kind of important whose TPR was that theory submitted under too.
Yeah, and there is another question that's related to that when we talk about theory. If you're not tracking theory, I think that was a question that I saw. If the training provider is not doing or not tracking theory, if it's a third party, the FMCSA says the training providers have to be the same for behind the wheel, road, and range, but it can be different for a third party. Something that to keep in mind is if your student does theory with a third party, that third party is going to be the one submitting theory scores. So you as a training provider don't need to take that theory score and submit it to your TPR. In fact, I definitely don't do that because you're not going to have the records showing that the student completed it, and you're not going to have the records to back it up if they ask, hey, where's your curriculum? I saw you submitted a theory score. So let the third party handle that unless if you have specific state requirements that you have to be the training provider for the theory and you want to work with a third party, get with that third party and find a way that you can license the content from them and actually incorporate that as part of your program rather than just sending them off to do it with a third party.
There's a question on the weekly progression sheet, the document. It's okay. But one of the things that I would encourage you is so often in the school business, we, kind of get into quality management. We deal with lag measures. And even if you're getting a weekly evaluation, you're getting old information and you're not getting the ability to interact and correct things as the week goes. Yes, there's nothing that says you can't use a weekly, but again, you're dealing in a lag measure there. If you're getting it daily, you can impact how that week goes a lot quicker. And again, and here's the other thing too. Yes, if I'm an instructor, at the end of Friday, I can do an evaluation on Jack. Yeah, that shows where Jack is Friday, but it's not doing anything for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Where was Jack Monday? And and here he is Friday. So again, you want to tell that compelling story. There's not a reg that says you can't do that, but I think things would go much better for you and your team if you can sit there and and let the student know daily how well they're doing or not doing, and they got an opportunity to impact that evaluation at the end of the week, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple other questions about Tim, I see there's one question from you. Is there some type, not you, Tim, but another one, is there some type of app that we can use to track this all? So FMCSA doesn't have any app or something like that to track it. That's where a third party or a service would come in. That's something that CDL PowerSuite does. We have what we call an instructor portal, which we're going to show just so you can see how we track training. But again, it's not a requirement to do it that way for sure. And then Scott did ask, what are some timers that can run at the same time? I don't know if you're talking about a system for that, Scott, or if you're more talking about hey, when can you have multiple timers running? So I'll try to maybe answer your question, but if you have a clarifying piece of that, please let us know in the chat. If timers are running at the same time, that can be done for the pre-trips, and it can also be done for range training, where you wouldn't have this as on the road. Road is going to be definitely one timer running at a time. But if you've got two stations in front of you and you're tracking straight line here and reverse offset here, then that would be something where you would have two timers running at the same time.
There's another question, and is there a requirement to have roadmap for range training? If that's what we're referring to as syllabus or lesson plans, that's actually one of the things they've also found coming up short in these audits. And they're absolutely dumbfounded, actually, when we were talking to them, that they'd go to a school and they wouldn't have range lesson plans or syllabus. So if that's what you're referring to as a roadmap, absolutely. You're going to be expected to have a syllabus and a lesson plan.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen now and just kind of show you guys how we take somebody through training. If I was an instructor working with a student.
And I think as you go through that demonstration, that probably answer the multiple timers thing too, Jack.
Yeah, for sure. So this is just an example of how we would set training up for someone. This is the student that I'm going to work with. And the event that we've been all talking about today is this A3.1 to 3.6 public road. So if I wanted to do training with a student in our system, what I would do is come in and select the plus button. And then I decide if I'm going to do training or an assessment. So for this, the training is going to be that 1 to 5 stars. And then the assessment is going to be a binary yes or no for this. So I'm going to do training because that's what I feel comfortable with a 1 to 5 star with this student. I come in and click training for this student. Then I'm going to see their average training score. So this is the kind of part of that telling the story of proficiency, their average score as well as their previous training score. This is the last attempt they made. And this is really helpful if another instructor is working with them, or even if I worked with them last week. You know, we all don't have like photographic memories of knowing exactly how the student did. It's nice to have a reflection point and see where were they at. Also, we have comments below. So if I want to see how someone else did on the training, I can see those comments and maybe correct some things that were happening. These are the regulations that we were talking about earlier. So this is kind of just built into what we do. But then, of course, if you have like trainings that you want to do or you want to modify training, that's also done in here. So if I come in and hit start on an event, that starts my timer up here, right? That time tracking piece is really important. It kind of goes back to this question of running timers. And I'll show you how we run like multiple timers. In here for our training, this is what we were talking about earlier, right? Our rubric, 1 star being unsafe, 5 exceeding expectations. If nothing else, please use a rubric when you're grading because then it creates consistency across your instructors. Don't just have a check mark. Take the extra step to do a 1 through 5. Document that student's proficiency and progress. In here as well, we also talked about having instructor manuals. We build instructor manuals into our curriculum so instructors can easily click on it and see what they're supposed to be grading them on. Because like we were talking about earlier, just saying vehicle controls is not enough to know where a student is at and what we're actually grading them on. So these are the points that we're looking for vehicle controls. We have one of those kind of for each one of these as well. So if I'm a student, or if I'm an instructor grading a student, I'm going to come in and give the student a grade for the day. So this is during training or after training. You know, we were talking about earlier, weekly checkoff sheets. It's hard to go back and remember how a student did on Monday versus how they did on Friday. So having like a daily sheet that you're scoring them on can help show that progression and proficiency. If you can remember all the way back to that point on Monday, great. And then just documenting that. But, you know, then you have to remember start and end times for students, what scores you gave them. And if you are documenting exactly how the regs kind of define it as, you need to have each one of these points in here. We've even seen it expanded where people go beyond just saying vehicle controls. They'll actually break it down into more points. So they'll actually have like left and right turn scored separately, lane changes scored separately. So this is kind of what we would consider like the bare minimum, but there are some programs out there that, you know, will have like a 20-point scoring system or 30, 40-point scoring system, kind of covering each little minute thing. If I'm done with training at the end for this student, I would come in and review this score to give comments and also have that final proficiency yes or no. In our system, we do have the ability to like add multiple timers. So if I was on the range working with a student, I could click this like green plus button here and select another student to work with to document time at the same time. So I could have multiple timers going. But I would come in. What was that, Tim?
Yeah, just so if you're an instructor on the range watching 2 trucks, you can have a timer going for each student at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you also have that automatic fill for the egregious stuff is always there as well.
Yeah, definitely. So typically I would come in and review the score. A lot of programs like to set the trucks. This is typically what I've seen is more of a state requirement. And the state like DPS or DMVs will ask you, hey, what trucks were they training in? I've never seen the FMCSA come in and ask that question. But that's typically more of a state requirement. So document that truck, add your comments in here. And then this is the big question, right? This is the question that we all look for is where was the student proficient on this drive? So did this student show proficiency? You're going to look at your rubric, right? You have your rubric here, you have your 1 to 5s, and you're going to make an assessment off of this of if they were proficient or not. There are other ways to do this. You could automatically set a proficiency yes or no based off of 80%. But how we see a lot of programs do it is you can give a student a grade, but if you don't feel like they're proficient, regardless of what the grade is, you have that ability to mark them yes or no for that. So for this, I'm going to say yes. This is going to timestamp, date stamp, have an instructor sign off, basically showing that at this point in time, this student was proficient on road, on this specific road drive and module. There might be other modules you do and train on, but this is really the meat and potatoes of what the FMCSA is looking for. And then you would come in and complete this event. Completing it saves the time. It saves the event to the system, or to our system, it would be saved to. And for schools that utilize our platform, it would save it to their account and their dashboards, where then they can see an entire student record. The reason why we wanted to show you this is just a way to document it. This is what we found to be the most efficient and effective way to do it. If you do it some other way, that's totally fine. But this is just the how we kind of teach things and how we provide value to schools and what schools kind of look for sometimes.
Yeah, and one of the key values to that is it gets you away from teaching the test. And what I mean by that, you get instructors, they'll start counting points, and they even get down to the students. And it focuses more on the process of getting that skill developed for the student instead of counting points. I mean, I think we've all probably done this long enough where you say a student would probably pass on points if you're taught nothing but the test, but really wouldn't be proficient. So this rubric and doing it like that, I always found it has been a huge benefit as far as actually getting the instructors to teach on the process of training the student to develop the skills instead of counting points.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple more slides to get through. Everything that you guys saw right there, that's how CDL PowerSuite documents it. We're a CDL compliance company and a software platform. So this is available. But we're not I don't want us to spend too much time going into that piece of it. We're here for education right now. If you are interested in documenting training the way that we do it, feel free to take a look at our site. Or if you want to reach out to us again after this, feel free to. We'd be happy to take you in a more in-depth view just to show you how it's done. And if it's something you guys like to utilize, you can definitely do that. One of the big pieces is record retention, right? So once you've actually done the training, what happens with that documentation and training? For the federal regulations, they require you to have it for 3 years after training. If you've gotten audited recently, you may have them coming in and asking for records beyond that 3 years. You can kindly say to them, hey, we've held the records for 3 years. We're looking at students within this time frame. A lot of these auditors are new, so they may not know that specific piece and may be looking at students just that are in the TPR, not necessarily within that 3-year window. So some things that you need to keep track of and document are, the applicant self-certification. And what do I mean by self-certification? Students need to have a documentation saying, or you need to have a signed piece of paper saying they're going to follow certain DOT regulations. And that exact verbiage is in the CFRs. We can also provide that if you'd like after this as well. We'll make a note of that to provide that language for that piece. As well as you need to have CLPs or applicable CDLs. So obviously your instructors need to have CDLs and instructor documentation that they are that they had a CDL for 2 years. And then, of course, we need to keep track of lesson plans for theory and behind the wheel, and then all of the training documentation that goes with that as well. Okay.
Mentioning your equipment and all that other stuff.
Yeah. So just kind of our key takeaways from today. We're kind of nearing the end of this. We're going to open up to a few questions here at the end. But document the story of proficiency. That's really what it comes down to. Find a way that works best for your program and document it. If you need help with that, you have questions about that. That's why we're here. We want to be an industry leader in this. We are an industry leader in this. We feel like we've come up with a good way to document it, but our way is not always the right way, right? You have a specific way of doing things, and it's just important that you're documenting that. Each student has a unique journey, so document those stories accordingly. Chapter 1 is going to be a lot different than chapter 2, especially between different students. And then, of course, be able to retell the story of proficiency. Tim had a great analogy. We were talking about this earlier. At 6 months down the road, can you come in as an outsider and pretend like you don't know anything about your organization? Can you come in and on a PDF, on a sheet of paper, in a software, anywhere that you document that proficiency, could you understand a student's journey? Try that exercise out and see, do you have all the pieces that they're going to look for? Because I'll tell you what, nothing's better than handing an auditor a PDF and knowing you're good to go, rather than them asking questions, where's this, and you're running around, you're stressed out because of all of that. Okay. That is kind of the key takeaways. We're going to open it up to questions. I see a couple more questions coming in, so I'm going to kind of answer some of these, and Tim, of course, hop in where you think it's relevant for that. There's some questions coming in about our program and how you track things. Yeah, we have a program that can document all of this stuff. It's on CDL Powersuite's website. Be happy to speak to people about that after this. But I'm going to kind of go into a couple of these other questions as well. Does the TPR stay registered with you even if you no longer provide training? If you are no longer providing training, the TPR will actually, if they see you're inactive for like 12 months, they'll send you a notice of proposed removal for that. And I believe you can also remove yourself from the TPR. Tim, do you want to touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, you hit it just on you got that right. And if you are an entity and say you graduated students in the past, and those students will always be tied to that TPR, but, and that entity, but, and it may affect you if you say you quit training and then came back a few years later. There might be a little tougher review for you to get approved again, but those students will always be tied to that TPR, and that TPR be tied to that entity at that time, because I actually asked Patrick about that once.
Yeah, good point there. See another question. What were the other sections? You have 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. I'm not sure exactly what that question's asking. It might be referring to the theory curriculum potentially.
Well, we were, it was going through some of the behind the wheel training and range training, different aspects of that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Tim's. Yeah. So the theory curriculum, you have your sections. You have sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are like our kind of overarching groups. And then you have within that, 1.1 all the way through 1.7, 2.2 or 2.0 to, I think it's to 2.5. It could be incorrect. And then 3.1 to 3.3. Those are all different sections, and those need to have curriculum that goes with it, and then also quizzes that go with it as well, or that's what we would recommend.
And what that does, go ahead. One of the other mistakes people make is they try to average that, but you have to pass each one of those individually. And why we do it and label it like that is because if an auditor comes up there, he doesn't have to work, he or she doesn't. It's exactly as the CR. It's right there in the regs, and that's like 380 A3.1.2 or something like that. It's exactly right there, so it can be audited really easy, and it provides a peace of mind for you as well, making sure you're not missing anything.
I got a question from Patrick here. Can theory be taught behind the wheel, and can proficiency be scored by observation? Theory is separate from behind the wheel, so that's going to be different. That's more of like a curriculum piece of it with quizzes. That's really what FMCSA is looking for, is like quizzes and tests that go with that. And like Tim was saying, documenting each one of those individually. And then can proficiency be scored by observation? A student can't, for behind the wheel, the student actually has to be in control of the vehicle to judge proficiency. It can't be done through observation. The only part where that like slightly deviates from is when the student still has to be behind the wheel, but when we're discussing 3.8 through 3.12 or A3.8 8 to 3.12. Another question we have is the webinars, the test could be done in class, i.e. verbal. It's my understanding that a quiz must be electronic written. Am I correct? I mean, you need to document the quizzes and the attempts that are taken and the scores. So know how that would be done verbal, getting everybody's individual scores. That's more like a group score where, we need to score students individually. Each student's going to have their own attempts and quizzes done.
One of the things we're seeing, these auditors are kind of not consistent yet. Some are going through and looking at that section and saying that they scored 80%. Then some auditors are actually wanting to see how they answered each question too. So it's a little bit of all across the board on how they're doing that right now.
Yeah. Okay, we got time for like one or two more questions here. I see another one here. What would be the steps to add hazmat to one of your services? Start providing. What does it look like? The documentation for this as well. Hazmat is largely it's just theory training, so you need to have each one of those sections covered and have its own quiz for it the same way. There's not a behind the wheel portion of that. For the state of Washington, that's the only state where it's required to have like a 16-hour class. I believe there may be a few other states that have like in-person requirements for that, where it has to be done in person, but a lot of states it can be done remotely as well. For each state, will theory be different? Theory will not be different for each state. There may be your state may have classroom hour requirements, but classroom hour requirements are a state requirement, and they're almost kind of separate from the federal requirements. So if you have classroom hour requirements, Tim, yes.
Yeah, I think where that may be coming from is like in Idaho, for when they go test for the permit, they got to know some open range laws. And down in Texas, when they go for a permit, they got to take almost the equivalent of a Class D license test as well. So those things will change by state, but the federal standard's consistent on the theory.
Yeah. From Scott, I'm in Colorado and I have extra training for driving in the mountains. Can I include that under A 3.1 to 3.6? Yeah, so I would honestly add those as separate modules, label them with stuff in there. So you can say beyond A 3.1 to 3.6, add just another box in there and then kind of go down and add whatever content and curriculum you want. That way you can document all of the federal regulations. And then in addition to that, you'll have your own as well in there. The one last thing that I'll add for the theory portion, I know a lot of school districts and stuff like that, they'll have their own curriculum that's either given to them by the district or the state bodies, especially when it comes to like passenger and school bus endorsements. So the federal regulations are the same, but your state or districts may have additional regulations or may want you to teach out of a specific curriculum guide for that.
These auditors are a little bit different. Just throw this in real quick. I mean, because we had one school, I believe in Indiana, when the auditor came in, they were looking for the pre-trip, the en route pre-trip, and the post-pre-trip as well. And, so you're liable to get a little bit different each auditor until they all get on the same page. This is just their second round. So as they continue to do this, I think they'll get a little more consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question here, and then we'll wrap things up. We really appreciate everybody, being here and taking the time. If you're a registered trainer and you hold a Class B license, this is one of the questions we have. Can you train one of your drivers with a Class A, or to train him to have the Class A? You cannot. You have to train within the license that you have, and you have to have had that license for 2 years to train someone on that. And then you also have to meet any additional state requirements. But yeah, again, I really appreciate everybody taking the time to be here today. Some questions that we would just leave you with that you can maybe take some time to answer yourself is, what is one change you could make to your documentation process? How can you improve it? Where do your instructors need greater scoring consistency? And last but not least, could your current records clearly support a final proficiency decision and tell the story of proficiency? Again, thank you everybody for taking the time to be here. If you have additional questions, shoot us an email, give us a call. We're here to support you and we're here to support this industry and make the roads safer out there. Thank you all.
If there's any questions we didn't get, we will follow up with you guys. We do appreciate your time.